August 10, 1944, 04:30 hours. Tinian Island, Northern Marianas. The pre-dawn air is thick with the scent of cordite, churned earth, and sweet decaying vegetation. For Private Kenji Tanaka of the 50th Infantry Regiment, it is the smell of the world ending. He lies in a shallow depression, the volcanic soil coarse against his cheek. His left leg is a universe of white-hot pain, shattered by an American .30 caliber round hours ago. The battle is over. The thunder of the naval guns has receded, replaced by the crackle of fires and the scattered, guttural shouts of U.S. Marines clearing the last pockets of resistance. He can hear their heavy boots crunching nearby. His fingers, numb and clumsy, tighten around the cold steel of his Type 94 pistol. There is only one round left. One final, honorable act prescribed by the Senjin-kun, the Imperial Army's Field Service Code. Do not be taken alive. The words echo in his mind. The voice of his commanding officer, a man now dead just meters away. Do not suffer the shame of capture. In his tunic pocket, pressed against his ribs, is a small folded photograph of his wife, Akiko, and their young son. He had promised them he would return a hero or not at all. Now only one path remains. The shame is a physical weight, heavier than the tropical humidity, more suffocating than the smoke. He thinks of the stories, the tales told by officers of the monstrous, barbaric Americans. They were demons, Oni, who would torture him, desecrate his body, and use his skull as a latrine. Death by his own hand was not just a duty, it was a mercy. He raises the pistol, the barrel cold against his temple. His hand trembles not from fear of death, but from the immense effort of will it takes to complete the act. He closes his eyes, seeing Akiko's face one last time. A heavy boot kicks the pistol from his grasp. A large shadow falls over him. He looks up into the tired, dirt-smeared face of an American Marine, no older than himself. The Marine says something, the words alien and meaningless. Tanaka braces for the bayonet, the butt of a rifle, the final, brutal end. Instead, a medic kneels beside him, cutting away his blood-soaked trousers with practiced efficiency. They give him water from a canteen. They bind his leg. They do not torture him. They do not execute him. They save his life, and in doing so they plunge Private Kenji Tanaka into a state of disgrace, so profound he has no words for it. He is no longer a soldier of the Emperor. He is a captive. His journey into an unbelievable new reality, a world of clean sheets, baseball games, and 3 full meals a day, is about to begin. It will be a world that will challenge his soul more than any battlefield ever could. To understand the profound shock that awaited Kenji Tanaka and tens of thousands of other Japanese prisoners of war, one must first understand the two irreconcilable worlds that collided when they were captured. On one side was the Imperial Japanese military ethos, a modern fighting force animated by a quasi-feudal warrior code. On the other was the Allied logistical and legal framework, a system born from industrial-scale warfare and international treaties. The bedrock of the Japanese soldier's psyche was a re-engineered form of Bushido, the way of the samurai. For centuries, it had been a complex ethical system for a warrior aristocracy. But by the 1930s, Imperial Japan's militarist government had stripped it of its nuances, forging it into a tool of absolute obedience and nationalistic fanaticism. This was codified in 1941 in the Senjin-kun Field Service Code, issued to every soldier by War Minister Hideki Tojo. Its message was unequivocal. Chapter 8, verse 3 contained the infamous line, "Do not be taken prisoner alive, but die and leave no ignominy behind." This was not mere suggestion. It was a sacred command. Surrender was the ultimate dishonor, a betrayal not only of the emperor, who was considered a living god, but of one's family, ancestors, and the entire Japanese race. Soldiers were taught that capture was a fate worse than death. Propaganda depicted Allied soldiers as inhuman beasts who would inflict unspeakable tortures. Therefore, the final act of a defeated soldier was to be gyokusai, or shattering the jewel, a glorious self-annihilation, often taking the form of a suicidal banzai charge or, if that was not possible, simple suicide. This philosophy explained the staggering casualty rates. In the Battle of Saipan, of the 30,000 Japanese defenders, nearly 24,000 were killed in action, and another 5,000 committed suicide. Only 921 were captured. The concept of a Japanese prisoner of war was, to the Japanese High Command, a statistical and ideological impossibility. On the Allied side, the approach to prisoners was governed by a completely different document, the Geneva Convention of 1929. This international treaty, which Japan had signed but never ratified, was a product of the horrors of the First World War. It was fundamentally a document of systems and logistics. It dictated in meticulous detail the minimum standards for the treatment of prisoners of war. It stipulated their right to humane treatment, adequate food and water, shelter and medical care. It outlined rules for labor, pay, and communication with their families. For the United States, Britain, and Australia, adhering to the Geneva Convention was not just a matter of law, it was a strategic and moral imperative. It was part of what they were fighting for, a world governed by laws, not by the whims of conquerors. Consequently, as the war in the Pacific intensified, a massive unseen logistical network was established to manage the trickle, and then the stream, of captured Japanese personnel. Prison camps were built in locations far from any conceivable front line, in the pine forests of Wisconsin, the dusty plains of Texas, the farmlands of rural Australia, and the rolling hills of New Zealand. These camps were not designed as instruments of punishment or revenge. They were administrative centers, built to house, feed, and secure enemy combatants until the war was over. The architects of these camps were quartermasters, engineers, and lawyers. Their primary concerns were efficiency, security, and compliance with international law, concepts utterly alien to the spiritual and sacrificial code that drove Private Tanaka and his comrades. The stage was set for a collision of realities, a clash not of armies, but of entire belief systems. For Private Tanaka, the hours and days following his capture were a hallucinatory blur of fear and disorientation. The journey began on a stretcher, carried by the same demons he was supposed to kill. Every act of care was a source of profound confusion. The morphine for his pain, the clean dressing on his wound, the sip of water, these were not the actions of monsters. They were the clinical, detached procedures of an enemy who viewed him not as a defiled warrior to be desecrated, but as a logistical problem to be processed. He was moved to a field hospital, a city of canvas tents filled with hundreds of wounded men, both American and Japanese. Here, the first layers of his identity were stripped away. His tattered, blood-caked uniform was cut off and burned. He was washed with harsh soap and dusted with delousing powder. He was given a set of plain American fatigues, the cloth rough but clean. He saw other Japanese soldiers, their eyes vacant with the same shame and disbelief. They avoided each other's gaze, isolated by their shared disgrace. They were no longer soldiers of the 50th Regiment. They were just bodies, tagged and numbered. The true journey began aboard a U.S. Navy transport ship. Deep in the vessel's hold, hundreds of Japanese prisoners were confined together. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, diesel fumes, and antiseptic. The constant deep thrum of the engines was a funeral dirge for their old lives. For days they saw nothing but the gray steel walls of their compartment and the faces of their fellow disgraced men. Their military hierarchy dissolved. Officers, once figures of absolute authority, were now just as helpless as the lowest private. The rigid structure that had defined their entire existence had vanished, leaving a terrifying vacuum. One of the most powerful agents of this transformation was recreation. The camp administrators, following Geneva Convention guidelines that mandated physical exercise, encouraged sports. The Japanese prisoners, to the surprise of their captors, enthusiastically embraced baseball. The game was already wildly popular in Japan, and soon camp leagues were formed. Prisoners fashioned makeshift gloves and bats, and teams representing different barracks or prefectures competed fiercely. For a few hours on a Sunday afternoon, they were not disgraced captives. They were ball players. The crack of the bat and the roar of the small crowd was a sound of normalcy that echoed strangely across the Wisconsin fields. They also organized sumo wrestling tournaments, built traditional gardens, and formed theater troupes that performed classic Japanese plays. Another profound shock was the access to information and education. The camps had libraries, stocked with Japanese language books, newspapers, and magazines, often supplied by the YMCA. Prisoners could read, for the first time, an uncensored perspective on the war. They read about Allied victories that had been downplayed or ignored by Japanese propaganda. They learned about the world outside the hyper-nationalist bubble they had inhabited their entire lives. Many camps offered classes. Prisoners could learn English, study mathematics, or take vocational courses in subjects like auto repair or agriculture. This was not just busy work. It was a deliberate Allied strategy to expose them to new ideas and skills, subtly preparing them for a post-war world. Medical care continued to be a source of disbelief. Men who had lived with chronic ailments for years received treatment. They were given eyeglasses, dental fillings, and surgeries for old injuries. The Allied view was pragmatic. A healthy prisoner population was easier to manage and less susceptible to disease outbreaks. For the Japanese soldier, who was expected to endure pain without complaint, this level of attentive care was a deeply personal and unsettling form of kindness. Perhaps the most potent symbol of their new reality was the camp newspaper. Many camps, like Camp Blanding in Florida, had their own mimeographed newspapers, written and edited by the prisoners themselves. They reported on camp news, sports scores, and events. They published poetry and essays. The very existence of such a paper was a testament to a system that allowed for, and even encouraged, a degree of self-expression and community organization among its captives. This world of baseball games, libraries, and paid labor created a profound crisis. Their entire society was built on the virtue of enduring hardship for the emperor. But here, in the heart of the enemy nation, they were experiencing a life devoid of hardship. They were safer, better fed, and arguably freer in their daily routines than they had been as soldiers in the Imperial Army. This unexpected outcome did not bring relief. It brought a deep and corrosive psychological conflict. They were living a lie, a comfortable disgrace that felt more poisonous than an honorable death. The psychological effect of this humane captivity was not peace, but a silent, brutal war waged within the minds of the prisoners in the confines of the barbed wire. The Allied camp system, with its comforts and routines, did not simply imprison their bodies. It laid siege to their souls, forcing a confrontation with their most deeply held beliefs. The result was a schism that split the prisoner population and, in some cases, erupted into shocking violence. For men like Private Tanaka, the primary emotion was a profound and paralyzing cognitive dissonance. Everything they had been taught was a lie. The Americans were not baby-eating demons. Their own leaders had sent them to die for a cause that was now being revealed as hopeless. This realization was terrifying. To accept it meant that their suffering and the deaths of all their comrades had been meaningless. To reject it meant clinging to an ideology that was being contradicted by the reality of every meal, every baseball game, every kind word from a guard. This internal conflict manifested in several ways. Many prisoners sank into a deep depression, a state of listless apathy the Americans called barbed wire fever. They would spend their days lying on their cots, refusing to speak or participate in activities, crushed by the weight of their shame. For them, the comfort of the camp was a constant mocking reminder of their dishonor. Others chose the path of cooperation. Seeing the futility of the Japanese war effort and grateful for their humane treatment, some prisoners began to actively assist the Allies. They provided valuable intelligence on Japanese military tactics, equipment, and morale. They translated captured documents and helped create propaganda leaflets to encourage other Japanese soldiers to surrender. These men, known as turncoats by the hardliners, often did so at great personal risk, believing they were helping to end the war and save Japanese lives. This created a third, and most volatile, reaction: militant resistance. In every camp, a faction of hardline militarists emerged. These were often NCOs or fiercely dedicated soldiers who viewed the cooperators as race traitors and the camp comforts as a decadent trap designed to weaken their warrior spirit. They sought to maintain the rigid discipline and ideology of the Imperial Army within the wire. They held secret courts, punished those who were perceived as too friendly with the guards, and planned for a final glorious act of gyokusai. This internal tension reached its horrifying climax on August 5, 1944. At the number 12 prisoner of war camp near Cowra, Australia. In the largest prison break of World War II, over 2,100 Japanese prisoners, armed with baseball bats, improvised knives, and a burning desire to die an honorable death, stormed the wire fences. They were not trying to escape to freedom. Their goal was to be killed in battle. Chanting Banzai, they charged into the machine gun fire of the Australian guards. In the ensuing chaos, 231 Japanese prisoners were killed, and 108 were wounded. 4 Australian guards also lost their lives. The Cowra breakout was a tragic testament to the power of the Senjin-kun Code. It showed that for some, the psychological torment of a comfortable captivity was so unbearable that a suicidal charge into machine guns was the only logical, honorable way out. It was the ultimate rejection of a reality they could not accept. When the voice of Emperor Hirohito crackled over the radio on August 15, 1945, announcing Japan's surrender, it did not bring immediate relief to the Japanese POWs in Allied camps. It brought a final, devastating wave of confusion and shame. Their nation, which they had been told was divinely protected and invincible, had been defeated. The foundation of their world had crumbled. The aftermath of the war placed these men in an impossible position. Repatriation began in late 1945, but for many the prospect of returning home was terrifying. In the eyes of Japanese society, they were not survivors. They were ghosts who had failed in their duty to die. Their names had been removed from town records. Their families had been informed of their deaths and had often already held funerals for them. To return was to face the disgrace of their survival. The stories of their return are heartbreaking. Some were met with cold silence, their families too ashamed to welcome them. Others found their wives had remarried. They were often unable to find work, branded as cowards. The comforts they had experienced in the camps became a source of bitter irony. While their countrymen had endured fire bombings and starvation, they had been playing baseball and eating ice cream. This disconnect created a chasm of experience that many could never bridge. A significant number of former POWs, unable to face the shame, chose to live the rest of their lives in obscurity, never speaking of their wartime experiences. Some even applied for permission to remain in the United States or Australia, believing they could never truly go home again. From a broader, strategic perspective, the Allied policy of humane treatment had a complex legacy. On one hand, it was a profound affirmation of Western ideals and the rule of law, a stark moral contrast to the horrific brutality of Japanese camps like Changi and Sandakan. It undoubtedly saved lives, and in the case of cooperative prisoners, provided valuable intelligence that helped shorten the war. The re-education programs, however limited, played a small role in planting the seeds of democracy that would be cultivated during the post-war occupation of Japan. However, the policy also highlighted a fundamental, and perhaps unbridgeable, cultural gap. The Allies operated on the assumption that humane treatment would be understood as a sign of moral strength and would encourage surrender. But to an indoctrinated Japanese soldier, it was often perceived as weakness, a trick, or a source of deep psychological torment, as evidenced by the tragedy at Kaura. The story of men like Private Kenji Tanaka is a poignant chapter in the history of the Second World War. It is a story without traditional heroes or villains, a story of a collision between duty and survival, shame and humanity. It reveals that the deepest wounds of war are not always inflicted by bullets and bombs, but by the shattering of a soldier's most fundamental beliefs. The unexpected comforts of the Allied prison camps did not free these men. Instead, they imprisoned them in a psychological no-man's land from which many would never truly escape. Throughout the voyage, Tanaka's mind was a maelstrom of indoctrination. He replayed the words of his NCOs. The Americans will fatten you up like pigs, then use you for bayonet practice. They will send you to medical labs to be experimented on. He and the others waited for the lie to be revealed, for the kindness to curdle into cruelty. Every meal was a test. They were given trays of unfamiliar food, soft white bread, tins of processed meat they called spam, bitter black coffee, and canned peaches. It was more food than they had seen in months of fighting on the islands, subsisting on meager rice rations and foraged roots. This abundance felt like a trick, a cruel joke before the inevitable slaughter. As the ship crossed the vast Pacific, the psychic distance from their homeland grew with the nautical miles. They were moving further and further from everything they knew, heading toward an unknown fate in a land they had been taught to despise. The fear of torture slowly began to recede, replaced by a gnawing existential dread. If they weren't going to be killed, what would happen to them? The code had no answer for this. The Senjin-kun taught them how to die. It never taught them how to live as a prisoner. For Tanaka, clutching the memory of his wife and son, this uncertainty was a torment worse than any physical pain. He was a ghost, haunting a world he was never meant to inhabit. While Private Tanaka and his compatriots wrestled with their shame, the Allies faced a unique and perplexing challenge. On the European front, capturing German or Italian soldiers was a routine, if massive, undertaking. These were soldiers from Western military traditions who understood the concept of surrender and the framework of the Geneva Convention. But the Japanese were different. The Allied forces, from the frontline Marine to the camp administrator in Wisconsin, were dealing with a prisoner population that, according to its own doctrine, should not exist. The initial Allied expectation was grim. Intelligence reports coupled with the ferocious no-surrender fighting on islands like Guadalcanal and Tarawa painted a picture of a fanatical, almost alien enemy. The first Japanese prisoners were often only taken when they were too wounded to resist or were knocked unconscious. Interrogators prepared for hostile, tight-lipped captives who would rather die than betray their emperor. Camp designers planned for high-security compounds, anticipating mass escape attempts and non-cooperation. They expected to manage a population of zealots. What they found was far more complex. The men who arrived at camps like Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Fort Hunt in Virginia, or the Cowra camp in Australia were not the 10-foot-tall demons of propaganda. They were human beings, often in appalling physical condition. They were typically young, malnourished, and suffering from tropical diseases like malaria and beriberi, in addition to their combat wounds. Their initial demeanor was often one of sullen, fatalistic despair. They fully expected to be executed and were baffled when they weren't. The job of the camp personnel was not one of vengeance, but of administration. The camp commandant, often a reserve officer with a background in business or law, was tasked with a complex managerial problem. He had to house, feed, clothe, and secure thousands of men who did not want to be there and, according to their beliefs, should be dead. His primary tools were the Articles of the Geneva Convention and the U.S. Army's regulations on prisoner treatment. The Allied strategy was multifaceted. First and foremost was security and containment. The camps were typically located in remote, isolated areas to make escape difficult. They were enclosed by barbed wire fences and monitored from guard towers. But beyond security, there was a crucial secondary objective: intelligence gathering. Specialized interrogation centers, like the top-secret facility at Fort Hunt, were established. Interrogators quickly learned that brutality was counterproductive. The key to unlocking information was to exploit the prisoners' psychological dislocation. By treating them humanely, offering them cigarettes, good food, and engaging in respectful conversation, they could begin to break down the years of indoctrination. The prisoner, already reeling from the shame of capture and the shock of humane treatment, often found himself in a state of cognitive dissonance that made him more willing to talk. Finally, there was a long-term goal of re-education, or what some planners called democratization. The Allies hoped that by exposing Japanese POWs to the realities of American or Australian life and values, fairness, rule of law, individual dignity, they could sow the seeds of a new, post-war Japan. The camp was to be not just a prison, but a classroom. The wardens and guards were not just jailers. They were the first point of contact with a world the prisoners had been taught was irredeemably evil. The Allied expectation evolved from managing monsters to rehabilitating men. Private Tanaka's arrival at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, was the beginning of the ultimate assault on his worldview. The action was not a hail of bullets, but a sequence of mundane events so contrary to his expectations that they felt violent in their normalcy. The train journey from the West Coast had taken days, winding through a country of impossible scale and prosperity. Through the guarded windows, he saw vast, orderly farms, bustling towns, and a civilian population that seemed utterly untouched by war. This was the first shock. The enemy homeland was not a desperate, struggling nation, but a thriving, powerful giant. The camp itself was another revelation. It was not a squalid pit, but an orderly, sprawling city of wooden barracks, laid out in a precise grid. Upon arrival, the prisoners were subjected to a rigorous intake process. They were stripped, showered again, and examined by doctors. Tanaka, who had never seen a dentist in his life, had a rotten tooth pulled and a cavity filled. The efficiency of it all was baffling. This was an enemy that had perfected the logistics of compassion. The first attack was the barracks. He was assigned to a long, clean wooden building. Inside were rows of metal cots, each with a mattress, a pillow, and 2 wool blankets. He was assigned his own bed. After months of sleeping in muddy foxholes or on the hard ground, the simple comfort of a mattress was a decadent luxury that felt deeply wrong. He was a prisoner, an object of shame. He did not deserve this. The second wave of the assault came 3 times a day, heralded by a bell. Mealtime. The prisoners would line up and file into a large mess hall. Here, the sheer abundance of food was staggering. They were given trays loaded with food they had only dreamed of. There was meat at almost every meal: beef stew, fried chicken, pork chops. There were mountains of potatoes, heaps of vegetables, and endless slices of soft white bread with butter. They were given milk to drink and desserts like cake and ice cream. For men who had been slowly starving on jungle islands, this caloric onslaught was a weapon of psychological warfare. At first they ate voracuriously, greedily, but soon the act of eating became fraught with guilt. Every satisfying meal was a reminder of their comrades who had starved to death. of their families back home who were subsisting on meager rations. How could they enjoy this bounty when their nation was suffering? Many prisoners would eat facing a wall, to hide the pleasure and shame on their faces. The final element of the shock was the routine. Life was governed by a predictable, unyielding schedule. Wake up, roll call, breakfast, work details, lunch, more work, dinner, free time, lights out. The work itself was another source of confusion. Under the Geneva Convention, enlisted prisoners could be made to work in non-military jobs, primarily agriculture or logging. For this, they were paid a small wage, typically 80 cents a day in camp scrip, which they could spend at the post exchange or PX. The PX was perhaps the most surreal place in the entire camp. It was a small store where a prisoner could buy things like cigarettes, candy, soap, magazines, and Coca-Cola. The idea that a captive could be a consumer, that he could earn money and use it to buy personal comforts, was utterly incomprehensible. It flew in the face of everything Tanaka had been taught about the subjugation of the individual to the state. Here, even in a prison camp, the individual had needs, wants, and the means to satisfy them. This was not imprisonment as he had conceived it. This was a structured, disciplined, and shockingly comfortable new existence. The unexpected outcome for Kenji Tanaka and his fellow prisoners was not a single event, but a slow, creeping realization that their captivity was not an ordeal of suffering, but a life of unprecedented safety and material comfort. As the weeks turned into months, the initial shock of the food and barracks gave way to a structured reality that systematically dismantled their warrior identity.